Okay.
Okay. Good. Uh, Deep thoughts, everyone. Love this group. Let us begin with the Lord's Prayer, and I will, with your leave, chant this in Syriac, which I learned to do when I lived in India for 2 months, and I prayed in Syriac every day. All the offices in the West Syrian tradition, which is what I can pronounce properly. So even though we're studying East Syriac, it's basically the same, just the O's and A's are a little bit different, but I will use the West Syrian version, so I have some sense of doing language justice. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Abunda bashmayo, netkadashmo, ktithel malkutoch, nechwe sebionoch, aikano deshmayo paro, labdan lakmot, sunkono nyamono, washpuk lan haubain, wachtohain aikano, dofnan shpakil haubain, Salani nesoyuno elo fason men bisho, metul dil kolo diloki malkutho, uchailo teshboto, lolam olmin, amen. So today we are looking at the East Syriac tradition, and you'll see a lot of continuity with what we look at tomorrow, looking at the West Syrian tradition, because they're both, Syriac is the common denominator in both cases. I say east of the East because what we're looking at is a tradition today that really flourished outside of the bounds of the Roman Empire, even that eastern part of which we think of when, if you're Eastern Byzantine Christian, for example, you think of yourself as an Eastern Christian. Well, there are people in the Persian Empire, Eastern Christians, who called us Byzantines the Western Christians. Because for them, we're in the West, you know, so anyone, you're Byzantium or Rome, that's all the West. The story is that Andrey was one of Jesus' 72 disciples who were sent out during his earthly ministry, and later sent by St. Jude to Edessa. You see Edessa here, and the order Persia and Rome has shifted at several points in their history, causing this people being vulnerable. Persian Empire, whether derived from the ministry of Andrey and Mari, or from other Jewish traders, perhaps, Jewish Messianic Jews, we could say today, who settled and or worked in the Persian Empire. It does seem to be people who were Syriac speakers from the get-go rather than people who were Persian speakers. It's hard to imagine that there were some Persian-speaking Christians, but the language that was used for scholarship and the liturgy was always Syriac. We don't have Persian Christian literature, for example, from this period. Patrick, do you have a question? Did I see your hand? No?
No, I didn't have a question. I thought I don't know if it was just me or if it was everyone, but we lost you. I lost you for a bit. Yuri's nodding as though it was everyone. We lost your voice. You froze.
How is it now? Oh, that's strange. I'm sorry about that. How is it now?
It's okay now. But we
can I ask? Yeah. Just remind people maybe to mute unless when you're speaking or asking a question, then unmute. I'm not sure why that happened, but sometimes the internet connection is not as stable as it should be.
Yeah, it is usually.
Okay, so what did?
Sorry, I just had a quick question. Yeah.
Please.
I can't hear. Sorry, I can't hear you. Hello?
It just happened again, Brian.
Not sure what I can do about that.
There might not be anything. We might just have to put up with it.
Yeah, I just had
a problem. Sometimes turning the video may allow the audio to have more bandwidth if necessary. not for everyone, but for the speaker.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I'll try a few minutes, and if there's still problems, let me know, and then we'll
Okay. I just had a quick question around
I think
72
we have,
disciples.
yes, yeah.
How did we get to 72 from 12?
So that's two different groups, right? Because Jesus sends out the 72 during his earthly ministry to prepare the way for him. We have the names of them, actually. We sing about them, Byzantine Rite. I mean, they're not in the Bible, but the Holy Tradition kind of preserves their names. We actually have a feast day where we actually sing about like every single name. So those are distinct group Gospels from the 12 apostles. Someone could just check the reference where in the Synoptics this is that Jesus sends out the 72 disciples. For me, and maybe just put that in the chat box, and yeah, you could just check the references for that in the Gospels afterwards.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we know they have these Syriac Christians in the Persian Empire, where they are a minority. It's the Zoroastrians. Zoroastrianism actually is a very important religion for the formation of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A lot of images, ideas, terms, such as paradise, for example, the word paradise, seem to have come originally from Persian and from Zoroastrianism. Some people argue it's the first monotheism, because depending on how your perspective, some people argue that the people of Israel were originally not strictly speaking monotheist, but henotheist. Meaning they sort of had the idea of Yahweh, their God, being the chief of the gods, not being the only God. And therefore, it was an evolution for them to come to actually monotheism, properly speaking, and that sort of the Zoroastrians, Zarathustra, got there first. But that's a tangent. We won't follow any further. So these Syriac churches preserve, it's really important, is that you understand they preserve a connection with original Semitic context of Christianity. It really cannot be Judaism. Christianity is not the daughter of Judaism, some people might think. Judaism and Christianity are both forms of Judaism. They are both daughters of the common mother, which is the religion of Israel that is recounted in the Old Testament. At the time of Christ, there are multiple interpretations of what it means to be Jewish. There are people who focus their piety on the temple, Sadducees. There are people who focused their piety on doing good works, daily prayer, sanctification, we might say, of daily life. That would be the Pharisees. There were even quasi-monastic movements, like the Essenes, who withdrew from civilization and were into the world and practicing basically poverty, chastity, and obedience before we call that. So if you look at the spectrum of Judaisms in the early at the time of the New Testament and even afterwards, you can see it. Then you can better locate how those Jews who then embraced Christ as Messiah still understood themselves to be Jews. That is, to be Jews who had received the fullness of the promises made in the Old Testament. This is the burden of St. Paul's message in the Epistle to the Romans, of course, right? He wants to say that Christ has come and fulfilled the promises made to the fathers, ancestors, and that now this covenant is being opened up to Gentiles without somehow Jews losing their place in it. So those Jewish Christians, or to use that term, those Messianic Jews, those Christians of Jewish ancestry, were the preponderant influence in forming the church of the Syriac church. Not coincidentally, they speak the language, a form of the language that was spoken by Jesus, that is Aramaic. They also ultimately are very important for the formation of Islamic civilization, and they are the translators of the texts of classical antiquity from Greek, which they had translated from Greek into Syriac, and then eventually into Arabic, right, after the 7th century. So we know that Christians were actually very active and privileged on consultants, we might say, for mediating between the Hellenic world, which they were very familiar with because of their faith being shared with Greek speakers, and these sort of newly sort of Johnny-come-lately Muslim colonists, we might say, Arab colonists from the Arabian Peninsula, who were originally Bedouins, who didn't even have any writing. Right? Basically, the Quran is the first serious expression of Islamic literature, of Arabic literature rather, and they rely on these Christians to bring that patrimony of antiquity, Plato and Aristotle and everything else, into Arabic. A little appreciated story is that this is what ends up leading those texts to be rediscovered in the West and paves the way for the Renaissance, because, as you probably know, the medieval West discovered Aristotle through Arabic translations that were preserved in Spain, right? In the period of the convivencia, when Jews and Christians and Muslims were living in the Iberian Peninsula in relative harmony. But those Arabic translations had, by and large, been done by Syriac Christians. Now, Syriac Christianity, and this is going to be a little bit confusing, and this is probably confusing part of what I did tonight. And this is not a course in Christology or church history per se. You do have to, if you don't know these things, you have to do a little bit of background reading to make sure you understand them somewhat. I have explained it several times, but I understand that people might be confused. The Syriac Christians embrace 3 ecclesial streams that correspond to 3 different interpretations of Christology. You have those, and they all have the same basic language, but they have adopted different views of Christ corresponding to the different ecumenical councils or non-ecumenical councils, the councils that are allegedly ecumenical, and that has in turn created structures or sort of reinforced ecclesiastical structures, which then in turn has a bearing upon liturgy. But it's important to note that liturgy can be shared among communities who actually differ in other respects. So we have the Syrian Church of the East, who do not accept the Council of Ephesus in 431. We have the Syriac Jacobites, we'll talk about them tomorrow. So the non-Chalcedonian or Miaphysite Syriac Christians, and they ultimately end up having a presence in India as well. And then we have the Chalcedonians, that includes Syriac Christians, Arabic-speaking Christians who accepted the Council of Chalcedon at the time of, and let's include the Maronites there, for example, as well as those who later came into communion with the Catholic Church, such as the Chaldeans, Syro-Malabars, Syriac Catholics, and Malankara Catholics, Syro-Malankara, we say both. And they all came into communion with the Catholic Church at a later point in history, and in doing so, ipso facto adopted the Chalcedonian Christology shared by Latin Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. Okay, so you keep those 3 streams in mind. There are Syriac expressions of pre-Ephesian, pre-Chalcedonian, and Chalcedonian churches.
I just had a quick question that's been bugging me in my reading. The Melkites,
Yep.
Where do they fit? Are they in here?
Yeah. So you have you have to distinguish. This is somewhat confusing also. The word Melkite gets used in 2 ways. If you're talking about the first millennium, Melkite, which just simply means the king's men, right? It's from Malka, right? We were talking about the Malka yesterday. We'll talk about that today too. It's a Syriac word for king, Malik in Arabic. So the Melkite are anybody who accepted the Council of Chalcedon. Those are the Melkites in the first millennium. That's what we mean when we say Melkite, regardless of what liturgy they used. As it turns out, the people who accepted the king, that is the emperor, Basileus, but he called himself a Basileus, right, just is king. The people who accepted the will of the ecumenical councils, which were associated with the emperor and the empire because they were convened in usually by the emperor and under imperial patronage. Those people gradually adopted, for the most part, the Byzantine rite. The Maronites are an exception, right? They accept the Council of Chalcedon, but they kept the Syriac liturgy. But the Antiochian Christians, Greek-speaking, who originally had other liturgies and eventually adopted the Byzantine rite. When we use Melkite in a second millennium context, especially post-1700, what we're referring to is the group of Antiochian Orthodox who reestablished communion with Rome in the 18th century. So these are Arabic-speaking Byzantine Rite Christians who are now Catholic. That's who the Melkites are today, but they're not even all Arabic. In the US, they're very multi-ethnic, actually. They have a lot of parishes that are extremely multi-ethnic. It's all English with a little bit of Greek or Arabic here and there, but other languages, Spanish or whatever. And you can easily visit those parishes. Canada tends to be quite Lebanese, the Melkites, but the US is a totally different kettle of fish. So when you're reading an article, you have to think about who the author is actually referring to. If they're talking about the 6th century, when they say Melkite, they simply mean anyone who accepted the Council of Chalcedon. They're not talking about Catholic versus Orthodox, because there was no division between Catholics and Eastern Orthodox at that time. Okay, that makes sense?
Brian, I also have a quick clarifying question. So the word, nowadays, the word Nestorian is considered to be politically incorrect, just like Monophysite?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, although you sometimes get Assyrian Christians sort of like being proud of it, the way that sort of, like they might call themselves Nestorians, the way Black people might call themselves niggers, like that happens. I don't know if you've come across that. So you can't say nigger, but a Black guy can say to another Black guy, "What's up, nigger?" Like, you know, like it's sort of an inversion of the insults, right? I guess the closest thing is if we kind of like greet each other, "Hey, UD8, yeah, I'm a UD8. We're good, you know, whatever, like, you know." So there are Nestorians who call themselves Nestorian because they're kind of like, we don't have to be ashamed of Nestorius. We have a Eucharistic prayer named after him, which they do. So if somebody else calls them Nestorian, it is generally in a pejorative sense. Just like when people call Jacobites, we'll see tomorrow, they're referring to 6th century Jacob of Bardeos, who's an important church father for them, but it's usually used as a term of a kind of reproof. It's sort of like you're not Orthodox, you're Jacobite, right? But they call themselves both Orthodox and Jacobite, right? So that's an interesting thing of the way different churches acquire names. Sometimes they're like Maronites, named after a famous person, or of course be named after a city or a people or something like that. And each of those choices tells you something, right? If you are a Lutheran, it tells you something in principle about what those people believe and maybe what may be a formative influence for them. So Syriac, as I've said, is the literary and liturgical language of these communities. It's a form of Aramaic, and it's 2 principal dialects. And Natalia asked the other day, why were the Jews speaking Aramaic? Very good question. After the exile in the 6th century, is that right? 6th century BC, right? Babylonian exile. They end speaking they end up speaking Aramaic because the Arameans had conquered that whole region of the Middle East, and even the Babylonians speak Aramaic, but he ends up speaking Aramaic. It becomes the lingua franca of what's of the Middle East and the Mesopotamia, as well as what is Holy Land. Yes, so 597 to 538. So that's a pretty significant. You know, the 2 generations of Jewish people live in the Middle East. We have the Targums, that is the commentary on the Hebrew scriptures written by Jews. Babylonian Talmud as well, like that's written in Aramaic, right? As its commentary on the law, but people are not speaking Hebrew anymore by this point. So that language is actually really, if you want to, go to town, there's an area, huge fields of research to be done in Syriac studies, anyone who's interested in graduate work, people have read everything in Greek and Latin pretty much, many times over, but there's many things in Syriac that have not been studied yet. And so there's a field there if you want to go, you can, it opens up, both Eastern Christianity, but also studying Judaism and relation to Islam, of course, because before the Advent, there's sort of before Arabic, and even after Arabic takes hold as a lingua franca in the Middle East, there's still many, many people who speak Syriac, and that's the case today. Many in the Syriac Christians, conversational language for them. It's not just a liturgical language, unlike, say, Coptic, which few people speak. Syriac, there are many people who speak Syriac, both in Turkey, there's some in Israel, and then in a lot in Iraq, and some in Iran as well. So this church did missionary work throughout the Far East. Joshua, by the way, is the sound and video coming through clearly? Yeah, great.
Yeah, it's quite fine. Thank you.
And we know that they ended up having authority over the church in India, somewhat similar to that authority in Egypt, in Ethiopia. That is, there were no bishops in the church in Kerala, India. The bishops always came from the Middle East and would ordain people there, and might not spend time staying there. They might leave and go back. And the church would just, when they needed a new priest, the bishop, they would send a letter and the bishop would again and ordain people, but there was no resident bishop, certainly not an Indian. And that church happily accepted that arrangement from what we can tell. That is, the church in Kerala was a unified Syriac speaking, in terms of liturgical language, they speak, some earlier version of Malayalam went for their vernacular. Up until the arrival of the Portuguese, this was a unified Christian community that embraced the East Syrian Christology, liturgy, and in fact, and was represented in the synod of the Syrian Church of the East, which was based in what's today's Baghdad, the Seleucid Ctesiphon it was called. The Assyrians also sent missionaries along the Silk Road into Tang, China, and perhaps as far as what's today's North Korea. It's called Parhe. And even Japan, there is evidence of Assyrian Christian woman being marrying a Japanese prince and taking her chaplain with him to Japan. It kind of blows your mind to think of them having divine liturgy in Japan in this sort of 9th century, like sort of almost 600 years before the Jesuits would arrive with Francis Xavier and so forth. Marco Polo.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say, isn't it the illuminated religion, or?
Yeah, that's true. They call it the religion of light, and it was also called the illustrious religion. Lust means lustre means shining, right, in English? So in Latin rather. So the word illustrious, although we use it to mean famous today, but it actually comes from the idea of shining. So one older designation of it is, of the translation of the Chinese, is illustrious religion. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So Marco Polo encounters Syrian Christians even in the 13th century. And Martin Palmer, who's sort of the leading authority on Syriac Christianity in China, says that he underestimates the numbers of people who would have been there. Like, not overestimates, but underestimates. He said several thousand, even tens, I think a few tens of thousands that he says. And Martin Palmer says there may have been still many more who were still there in the 13th century. Really quite astonishing. Mongol rulers, which was the dynasty that came after Tang, that were not favorable to the Syriac Christians. One was Mongolians, and they did not support this the way that the Ben had. There's one, at least only, I think only one that they know of. They're looking for others, examples of what would have been an Assyrian church. Now, it looks very Asian, but it's been well argued that this is in fact a Christian church because of its orientation to the east, which marks it off from all other Taoist and Buddhist buildings, which have been oriented, I think, to the south. I think they are in something like that, but it's definitely not to the east. So it's today used as a Buddhist temple, but people argue that this was originally a Christian church, and even the local residents acknowledge that fact. As you saw, if you've seen that video of, I posted for you to watch, the BBC Christianity, the first Christianity, where there's a whole segment where Dermot McCulloch goes to China and he visits this church and speaks with this guy I'm talking about, Martin Palmer. Here is the very famous Shanfu Stele, S-T-E-L-E, that they also go visit in that video. You really want to watch that. It's a lot of fun, and it's such an interesting story. And this, actually, they had a replica of this in McGill in the Faculty of Religious Studies when I was studying there. And I didn't realize at the time its significance, written in both Syriac and Chinese, and an interesting example of enculturation, because they try to, there's a bunch of statistics on here that see the names of the churchmen who were monks who were serving in China, Alopen and other people. But then it has a long series of poetic odes that basically give an account of the gospel in Taoist language. God appointed the cross as the means for determining the 4 cardinal points, and he moved the original spirit and produced the 2 principles of nature, yin and yang, right? So, and somebody said yesterday, like, we're talking like enculturation versus syncretism, right? Like, at what point does enculturation become something concedes too much to the culture? And that's obviously something we could discuss. Can somebody read this for me, please? This is a section of can someone read this out loud, please?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
From the Ode of the Nestorian Tablet. The true Lord is without origin, profound, invisible, and unchangeable, with power and capacity to perfect and transform. He raised up the earth and established the heavens. Divided in nature, he entered the world to save and to help without bounds. The sun arose, and darkness was dispelled, all bearing witness to his true original. When the pure, bright, illustrious religion was introduced to our Tang dynasty, the scriptures were translated and churches built, and the vessel set in motion for the living and the dead. Every kind of blessing was then obtained, and all the kingdoms, enjoyed a state of peace.
So the vessel set in motion would be the Mass, right? Be the liturgy. That's what he means by the vessel set in motion for the living and the dead. Prayer offered, of sacrifice offered for living and the dead. Every kind of blessing then obtained. Very interesting, and yet it doesn't really talk about, the death and resurrection of Christ. So it somehow manages to sort of talk about the Christianity without that, and it's perhaps in that sense missing something. It talks about the cross, but not exactly about the death and resurrection. I've read the whole thing, and that's sort of missing.
So what would that tablet be used for?
These steles, now they're collected in a museum, but they were basically just a way of commemorating anything really important. So you could commemorate a battle or the names of family members, your ancestors. It could be names of kings. So the presence of this stele and the fact that it's written in both Syriac and Chinese is seen as a testament to the success of Christianity in this time period, when it was not only tolerated but enjoyed a certain amount of official favor, that they could build and they could make public monuments that would tell their story, that would preserve the memory of what had been done up until that time. So today we have the Assyrian Church of the East, including some in India, only a few thousand in India, Chaldean Catholics, the Syro-Malabar Catholics, far and away the largest, at almost, they may well have almost 4 million. And this is an interesting example, we haven't seen this yet, where it's the Catholic churches where the bulk of the people who practice the tradition in question are, right? In the Byzantine Rite, all the Eastern Greek Catholics were to disappear, God forbid, there would still be plenty of people to serve the Byzantine liturgy. But the majority of people who are Byzantine Rite Christians are Eastern Orthodox. But the majority of people who are East Syrian Rite Christians are actually Catholics. The Assyrian church is today quite beleaguered, not least because of all that it suffered in the 20th century. So an untold story, really. Everybody's heard of the Armenian genocide, but most people don't realize that the Assyrian Church of the East also suffered great losses when they were basically promised their own homeland by the Western powers, and they backtracked on that, and so ended up finding themselves, not unlike the Kurds, at the mercy of the larger Arab Muslim population. They, even today, have resisted Arabization, and this is an interesting fact that is quite distinguishes them from the Chaldean Catholics. The Chaldean Catholics have no problem having Qurbana in Arabic. At the Chaldean Cathedral in Toronto, they have one Qurbana in Syriac, one in Arabic, one in English every Sunday, based on what I remember from the last conversation with Mar Bawai Soro, who's the bishop there, a friend of our institute. The Assyrian churches will not serve the liturgy in Arabic, because for them, think of the Armenians, the Syriac is the thing that distinguishes and preserves them and their identity vis-a-vis the ambient culture, which is Arabic speaking and Muslim. And these people feel, just like the Copts, that they are the original inhabitants of these lands, right? They go back, who are the Arabs? The Arabs are these, goat herders who come out of the Arabian Peninsula on a sort of a, on riding the wave of military conquest, but basically were Johnnies come lately and end up taking over Mesopotamia and imposing Islam and Arabic, but that these people say, no, but that's never, we were here before that. And we are the descendants, the Arameans, going back to one of the earliest peoples recorded in the Bible, right? My ancestor was my father was a wandering Aramaean. We hear about the Arameans already in the early chapters of Genesis, right? So to be an Aramaic or Syriac speaker is to make a claim to a certain continuity of identity that goes back, example, to the glories of Babylon and Sumerian and Akkadian, Akkadian, not Akkadians like from Nova Scotia and Louisiana. That's the different Akkadians, but culture and civilization. So that has partly contributed also to their decline, because they do not do missionary work either. Language is very, very important, as I said, preserving their identity. This is quite a shock in a way, because if we look back in history, we see that this was a church that at one time was very diffuse geographically and included people. They used Syriac, of course, in liturgy, but ostensibly included people of a whole variety of backgrounds. Today, it's basically just Central Asians and others, Mongolians, even some. We know there were some Christian princesses in Mongolian dynasty who were Christian, right? Genghis Khan had a Christian wife, Syriac Christian wife, and so forth. Tamerlane, I think. But in any event, you can find them today concentrated in certain places: Sydney, London, Detroit, Windsor, Toronto has a huge community, actually. And it's interesting because they, even when I was in India, they told me that there were some Syrian Christian families from India who had immigrated to Toronto, would go to the Assyrian Cathedral, but don't, because in India they use Malayalam, use the Syriac very much, and they just found it very difficult to be part of their own church because of the cultural and linguistic differences. The Chaldean Catholic Church is very interesting. It has basically actually the original hierarchy, which is to say that the original Assyrian hierarchy in communion with Rome, and the hierarchy that, Episcopal line that is now in the Assyrian Church, is actually rejected that union. It's very complicated. It went back and forth several times, and sometimes there were parallel patriarchs. The person to read for all of these nitty-gritty details is Aidan Nichols, Rome and the Eastern Churches, where he tells the story of each church and sort of often political intrigues that were going on behind the scenes. But it should be noted noted that, none of the, Eastern Catholicism is never reducible to politics, even if that often plays a factor. One finds people who are quite insistent on stressing that their tradition, that there are theological reasons to be in communion. I'm sorry, I don't see people right now. Are people still there?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah.
Yep.
What are you seeing
I just see blank screens.
from everyone?
Yeah,
Oh, because
it's weird.
I still see everyone.
Me too.
Yeah, it's weird.
That's
Okay,
right.
it's just okay. Oh, there's some music there. Okay. So so Roman Eastern churches, if you're looking to go into more in depth, the Chaldeans, even down to the present day, Marbo Isar is an example. He was a Syrian churchman, part of Catholic Syrian dialogue. This is the present bishop, Chaldean bishop of Toronto. He was a Syrian Orthodox, and as a result of the ecumenical dialogue, became convinced that it was important to be in communion with the Savior, so became Catholic, and it was a public relations disaster because the Catholics didn't really want to take him because they didn't want to be accused of sheep stealing, a bishop of all, and he had faithful priests and faithful came with him. The Syrian, like, told you to have ecumenical dialogue with the Catholics, not go become Catholic, So it's one of these things where, dialogue, everyone's in favor of dialogue until it actually accomplishes something, right? And if somebody actually feels they do something as a result of it, it can often be counterproductive, because if a community feels small and marginalized, as the Assyrians do, to lose one of their leading intellect scholars, as Marbawai is, for him to become Chaldean Catholic, was a very difficult, he suffered a lot in terms of the being ostracized. And all his family is still the Syrian Church of the East. So such in common, the things that, are the differences often prove quite painful. The Celts also suffered many losses in the World War I, and of course suffered grievously under ISIS in up to the present day, as have also the Syrian Church of the East Syriac Catholics, Syriacs, and others. I mentioned that they have embraced the use of Arabic, and actually have been, even in some instances, attained high positions. The former Minister of Defense, I think it was Tariq Aziz, under Saddam Hussein, was a Chaldean Catholic. So by embracing Arabic, Chaldean strategy has been to sort of stress their solidarity with the Muslims, who are the majority in Iraq. Whereas the Syrian Church of the East has stressed their difference from, right? And that's itself interesting, how worship becomes an index of a community's attempt to either integrate into a large community and make peace with it, or to distinguish, even separate itself from that community. Now, the East Syrian liturgy goes back to the rite of Edessa, which we saw on that map, which was one of the centers of where Ephraim the Syrian carried out his ministry, the other being Sebes. It has been described as a fusion of Judeo-Christianity with the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Iranian cultures. There are Christians still today in Iran, and that even though Iran is Muslim, that's Shia Muslim, and it's a very different kind of Islam than that of the Muslim world. Some people would argue that Zoroastrianism never really goes away, but that it accounts for the differences between Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims, and that also that the presence of the Christians in Iran has given Shia Islam a different take. There's certainly many rituals in Shia Islam, and also in Sufi or mystical expressions of popular mystical expressions of Islam, that seem to come from Christianity, such as singing, for example, which Muslims generally, Orthodox Muslims, don't do as a communal practice. I've mentioned several times, and you will have read, I trust by now, the TAF's article, consecration, that this community preserves the oldest complete Eucharistic which has been remained in continuous use. Right? We have the Didache, we have prayer from apostolic constitutions and others, but we have no other evidence of a Eucharistic prayer which has remained in continuous use down to the present time. Bread is baked fresh for every Eucharist, as we have already discussed, and to which the malka, or holy leaven, needs to be added. As Taft explains, this is a very custom, regardless of its historical basis, because it helps account for, it helps demonstrate the belief of the East Syrians in the real presence and in the continuity of their with that of the self-offering of Christ, which is obviously encapsulated in the ritual of the Last Supper. Chaldean Catholics, if you've gone and read that text which I put there, the Chaldean Qurbana, inserted the words of institution in, and it's worth noting that even the Assyrian Church of the East uses two other Eucharistic prayers, one of Nestorius and one of Theodore of Mopsuestia, both of which also, as the century this be seen across the churches as an essential element of Eucharistic praying, that you have some reference, you quote Jesus, whereas you've read the Didache, you can see there's another example of an early Eucharistic prayer where they don't have those words. And so there was a time when people did not feel the need to quote Jesus explicitly in order to be doing that which he intended. I only see Michael. Are you sure? Is everyone else okay still? It's really strange not seeing people's faces. Have I lost people or?
Yes, we are here.
We're still here. Yeah.
I'm here, but I'm having a lot of trouble. You're cutting in and out. So maybe it's something to do with the connection.
Yeah, we might want to log on and off at supper time.
Okay, so
That's why I turned off my video.
What's that? Sorry.
That's why I turned off my video, so that I can get a better connection, better audio.
Oh, okay. So am I breaking up? Am I breaking up when I'm speaking though?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yes, sometimes.
Do we want to, I don't know if it'll work or not, but do we want to all turn off our video and see if it helps with the audio? Or
Let's try it.
I don't know if it will, but
Brian, I have a question. I don't want to take you on a tangent, but
Sure.
I am interested in learning about.
As you realize, I hate tangents, Noel. So don't you dare put me on a tangent.
I am interested in learning about how Eastern Christianity influenced Islam, and in what ways it did.
Yes.
Maybe you can give me some sources I can read or something. I don't know.
I mean, you could do an interesting on that. A very obvious to point to is the 5 pillars of Islam, right? All of which have parallels in Judaism and Christianity. You have the Shahada with the creed, right? Profession of faith. You have the Shema in Judaism, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord. The Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? And we have the creeds in Christianity. And then you have the almsgiving, right? We have tithing in Judaism and Christianity. You have pilgrimage to Mecca, but Muslims originally prayed facing Jerusalem, so which is the third holiest city for them after Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. And so Hajj, which we have also, pilgrimage, right, to Jerusalem or what have you. Prayer 5 times a day, obviously. Where does that come from? We have Liturgy of the Hours, right? We know that Muhammad was in touch with Christian or quasi-Christian communities in the Arabian Peninsula and perhaps Yemen. where there was in fact there various communities, also Ethiopia, of course, and so strange versions of Christian stories and sometimes make their way into the Quran. The very fact that the Quran says that the Trinity is God and Mary and Jesus, right, shows that they got that idea from somewhere. They knew there was a Trinity and they knew that there was veneration of Mary, so they didn't understand that, so they interpreted it as kind of God, Mary, and Jesus, and then sort of criticized Christians for saying God's a wife, etc. Which you know these things. So, but we know that Muhammad encountered Christian ascetics, and so would have been familiar with the practice of prayer at set times in the day. What's the last one I'm missing? Shahada, Zakat, Hajj, Ramadan, fasting, right? Obs, like Lent, right? We know Lent's well established by the 5th century, 4th, 5th century. So, you know, they're practicing fasting, and Muslims adopt that as well. Month-long fast, basically.
Is there
It's
any
actually really,
influence the other way? Sorry.
yeah, carry on.
Is there any influence the other way?
From Islam to Christianity?
Yeah.
Won't count for that. There is a sense that Christians all start using Arabic, and the Arabic language is formed, as I said, through the literary form, through the writing down of them after Muhammad's death. Mind you, it's written down. No, nothing's compiled during his life. So Arabic expressions, even the name for God, get used by Christians in worship. So that would be one example of sort of a Arabization of Christianity, which Christians are not all comfortable with. You get some, like Theodore Abukura, he's an Arabic theologian who's quite happy to write his theology in Arabic. Others, like Copts and Syrian Christians, who are more ambivalent because they feel that if they don't use the languages that were sort of sanctified, as it were, by being the early centuries and being sort of with the Greek theological lexicon, if they depart from those languages, that they are not going to be on firm ground in defending their faith. That there's not a confidence right away that Arabic is a sufficient vehicle for communicating the truths of the Christian faith. Although Arabic is a very rich language, like any language can express anything, and indeed Arabic-speaking Muslims tend to think, well, all Muslims actually tend to think of Arabic as the divine and perfect language, which is superior to all other languages because God speaks that and reveals the Quran in Arabic. There will also be influence in sort of the shying away from adorning churches. So this is more like a negative influence, that the Assyrian Church of the East seems to have stopped having sacred images after the arrival of Islam in their churches, such that people think that they never did have any, but now they know through archaeology that some of the early Assyrian churches were painted, but because Muslims were opposed to figurative representation, becomes easier to sort of not raise the hackles of your neighbors, wherein the same thing happens among the Syriac Orthodox and Copts. Another example would be the prostrations, right? Head to the ground. This is an Eastern Christian practice that's adopted by Muslims, taking off your shoes when you go into the holy place, that as well.
Certainly.
Yeah. And in our architecture too, many churches are turned into mosques, right? So you have the Mosque of Mass. It's what's his name? Dermot McCulloch talks about this in that video too, right? He talks to a Muslim there, and he visits a mosque, which was at one time a church. And they still have relics of John the Baptist there, who is venerated as a Muslim prophet. The curtain, again, the role of the curtain, which we saw with the Armenians, pleasure, is drawn throughout the week and symbolizes the sin of Adam and Eve, which causes this expulsion from the garden. And then is parted or opened during the divine liturgy as a symbol of the opening of heaven and the incarnation of Christ. And it's drawn and parted at various points, just as in the and other traditions. The peace is given from the altar by the clergies to the acolytes, who then pass it to the faithful. And maybe you've seen this beautiful gesture where you put out your hands and someone else then clasps your hands, embraces your hands, and you both kiss and then you go on to the next person like that. And so the peace is passed out throughout the congregation, very vividly kind of dramatizing the way in which the peace among peoples comes from peace with God. Only other church where communion is given separately and the communion, the host is placed in the hand. No other church does this anymore, as you know. There's other means. They were wanting to pursue a series of reforms after the Second Vatican Council. People were inspired by this practice among the Syrian church, in which the body and blood are distributed separately and given into the hands. What they do when the faithful approach is they put out the censer, and the faithful kind of bathe their hands in incense, sort of purify their hands before they will put their hands out. And they won't take to put in their mouth. They'll put their hands out like this and bring their mouth to their hands to make sure that they don't lose any of the crumbs or particles of the body.
Brian,
The priest administers. Yep.
Brian, you mentioned about how like theology sort of builds up around practice, and
Yep.
has there been theology that's built up around that? Because that's been a very contentious issue, at least in the Roman Catholic Church right now, considering COVID. You know, saying like I would never consider receiving, you know, the Eucharist on the hand. Like that would just be so sacrilegious. So I'm curious if there's a theology that's built up around that in their church.
You know, it's just a conservatism that's held on to an older practice in which, and part of the difference is that in the West, in the Roman Catholic context, it is new enough still that it's really seen as being at odds with the received piety, right? Because for centuries, for over a millennium, Roman Catholics, people have been kneeling in the West since the end of the first millennium, if not before. Receiving on the tongue is also about just as old as that as well. So you've got your people who have brought in, the reforms that made it possible to receive in the hand, really kind of pushing against well-established patterns that were the way in which Western Christians also expressed their devotion and adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. Historically, the fact that people would kneel and receive in their mouths distinguish Roman Catholics from Protestants, right? And there was also a certain polemical dimension that this is how, with our disposition, we take to show that we believe in the real presence, and that it's a gift, right? We don't take it for ourselves, but we receive it as children and being fed and so forth. The other aspect is that communion in the hand has gone hand in hand with, no pun intended, the multiplication of extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion. So you have the loss of the communion rail, you have people distributing the body and the blood who are not vested, so lay people who simply come up at the time of communion and assist. And so that's a completely different dynamic than what you would see in an Assyrian church, where it's only the priest distributing the body, only the deacon distributing the blood. And as I said, people bathe their hands in the incense to purify their hands. So you've got a traditional practice which looks like the same as what's being done at one level, but it's not, because there's other factors that point to people's that show that other elements by which people demonstrate their reverence, right? A conservatism with respect to who is allowed to distribute the gifts, for example. The Assyrians also preserve a very beautiful custom where the priest receives the precious blood from the deacon, and the deacon receives the precious body from the priest. So that even the priest has to receive from another. He doesn't just give himself communion, he actually receives the precious blood from the deacon. And so there's always this idea of being fed rather than, as it were, feeding oneself, right? So yeah, that's a really good question. It is hugely polemical, and it doesn't really help when people on either side say, well, people say, well, yeah, there's a precedent for this in the Christian East. The question is, like, it's a different context. It's just like you can't necessarily take, you can take words sometimes from one language into another, but you can't usually take grammatical structures. You can't take gendered nouns from French and put them in English. Just because they're there in French and actually necessary doesn't mean you can put them in English and have it work in the same way. So that's what people are finding, I think, is to compel people or even allow people to receive in the hand in the West takes on a whole different catena of meanings than it would in the East Syrian, yeah, where they simply think that that's just the way we've always done it, sort of thing. It's not like, you know, of course you've got the curtain and everything too, so a lot of things that indicate the sacrality. Nobody's questioning the sacrality of what's happening, whereas that's often one of the criticisms of Western practices, that the Mass doesn't feel sacred because there's a number of things that put the emphasis on the horizontal, as it were, rather than the vertical, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm having problems with that, Brian. I
You're
really
having,
am.
you're having problems
with the ethos of the new Mass, you know. I mean, I was born into it, you know, and it was never, I mean, I was just used to it. It was never a bad thing. But now that I've been experiencing the Eastern Church, and especially now, like just seeing other traditions, you know, in this class, I feel that it saddens me that the Roman Church has lost. I feel like it's lost a lot. You know, it's lost that sense of the sacred. And if it were up to me, you know, I would definitely say it'd be better to restore a lot of the lost traditions.
Blame
well,
Thomas
no,
Aquinas.
you know, Pope Francis is getting old. Well, we're going to need another pope at some point soon. So, you know, maybe we'll put your name forward and see what happens. There is precedent for electing to the papacy someone who's not a bishop or even a priest, right? St. Ambrose was a layman when he elected himself. There's a Mennonite priest I was his director when I was at St. Paul. I was telling him, I said, you guys got to stop this Mass facing the people thing. This is a complete imitation of, you know, Novus Ordo, nothing to do with the Maronite tradition. Like, I know. He said, I'm patriarch. He says, I'll change it back. That was his way of saying, I don't want to be the person who has to tell people to stop doing it until I've got the authority that I can tell people to stop doing it, you know, so. A few more slides and we'll take our break. In the East Syrian tradition, marriage is actually not a sacrament. So it's actually just like what we would call a sacramental. They have 7 sacraments, but they're not the same 7 as the other churches. The sign of the cross and the consecration of the oil and the malka are sacraments. And marriage and private confession is not, and baptism and chrismation are seen as one. But obviously richly sacramental understanding of the wedding service, and this is evidenced in this slide here. They take dust from the tombs of the martyrs and mix it with the wine that is drunk. It sounds kind of gross, but you can see how it's very beautiful as a symbol of sort of the martyrs and their very bodies reversing the course of death, right? The course of death that comes at Eden, with the expulsion of Eden. The martyrs, who are the first for resurrection because they give their own bodies, right? Christ so dwells in them to enable them, to give them the courage to give their own bodies as a witness to him and to the resurrection, right? And therefore that the dust even of their graves is hallowed. And there's a great veneration of the saints in the Syrian Church of the East, as of course there is across the Catholic and Orthodox churches.
Does this have anything to do with the Lord of the Rings?
I'm not in any direct way, except that we were talking Jung earlier, that there's archetypes that Tolkien is exploiting deeply Christian archetypes in his fiction. So yes, if it's true one time in Middle Earth, it's true perhaps also elsewhere.
Yeah, all the Middle Earth lovers out there, they have no idea that they're actually Christians, but they are.
This is true. It's true. So I didn't realize it's already 6:25. Let's take our break now. If everybody could try logging off I'm going to actually close this, end the meeting, and then restart it. And let's see if that makes a difference with the quality of the recording. Is that all right? So 15 minutes, when you come back, I'll right away, I'll close and restart it for those who want to come back and chat with each other on the break. Otherwise, we'll see you back at 6:40. Thank you. All right, so we were talking about East Syrian worship. And as Natalia was saying, she's interested in this practice of the Malka, and that's distinctive. You'll note that in every lecture, I'm trying to highlight the things that are distinctive in a given tradition, because there are, of course, a lot of things in common, and some of the differences are so nuanced that we can't really get into them. It require a very careful study. That's the kind of work that you see in the Bradshaw and Johnson, by the way. I mean, if you do get really interested in this stuff, then that's what you want to do, is you want to sit down and read those things, read the different anaphoras, compare the different elements in the anaphora and where they're located, common phrases, common terms, distinctive phrases and terms, ideas, and the different kinds of other elements that get aggregated in the total presentation of the banquet, right? Everybody has the bread and wine, as it were, and has a priest and has some prayer, but then beyond that, there's all sorts of things that give the density, symbolic substance to these rituals. And so if you really want to get into the details, that will require a lot more research. So again, this is just an introduction in this course, but hopefully it gives you some sense of the distinctiveness of each one of them. So this tradition is not practiced, as one might imagine, by the Chaldeans, who abandoned it after coming into communion with Rome, not least because it was mocked by other Christians for not being real. In other words, it's fine to have a tradition. Every church has traditions of popular piety, legends of saints and miracles and other things. And most of the time, people don't really bother to try to distinguish what things are true and what are not. But once in a while, you will have a tradition focusing its attention on something and deciding maybe we shouldn't do this if we can't demonstrate its historicity. Something like that happened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with the Bollandist Fathers. It's a subset of Jesuits in the West. When they went through the Roman martyrology and the lives of the saints and basically excised any saint for whom there was not sufficient historical grounds to maintain their veneration, which is why you will not find churches, Roman Catholic churches, celebrating feasts of St. Barbara or St. Christopher, for example, anymore, even though they were greatly beloved in Catholic history, and people have medallions of Christopher and a lot of women named Barbara, but people did not, the church at large felt that these saints were not attested historically, and therefore it does not do us any favors, as it were, apologetically speaking, to combine things that we say are historical with things that are simply edifying, and therefore the liturgy should privilege those things that are historical, because Christianity is historical religion. Ironically, and you study this if you read into sort of philosophy of history and a bit, as I have with Ricard, there are different ways of understanding historicity, right? And the different ways of representing historicity. What's going on in this Malka is the Assyrian church's way of representing the history. It may not in of itself be like this. In other words, it may not be that there was St. John the Apostle who took a loaf, who then kind of dried it after intincting it with the precious blood, and then mixing it and distributing it so as to kind of maintain this continuity. But what that tells you, in other words, paradoxically, is the non-historical story tells you how important the history is, that people need to, as it were, invent some way of reminding themselves of where they've come from and what they're doing. Does that make sense? So it's actually, and this, you can see this in other traditions. In the Byzantine liturgy, all the time, we have this very elaborate hymnography. And we have, for example, the Akathist hymn, where we have Gabriel speaking to Mary, Joseph speaking to Mary, Mary speaking to shepherds and wise men and different people. And we know at one level that she didn't have these conversations. We know it's just entirely the fabrication. It's a dramatization. It's the work of fiction, right? The Akathist did not occur like that. There's no transcript. There's no Zoom recording of Mary having these conversations. But the reason we have hymns like that, and we have them for all our services, and I developed this in my book using Paul Ricoeur's work on this area. Sometimes the kind of history that you're dealing with is so singular that there's no normal way to account for it and represent it in its significance. Ricoeur uses the example of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and says, how do you wrap your mind around 6 million people? You can't. What you can do is make a movie like Schindler's List, right? Which, let's say, is historical fiction, because even if it's based on a real person, obviously not everything that happens in any movie is exactly as it happened. It looked like that, didn't happen exactly like that. And we generally accept that a film is going to use fiction in order to teach us truth. It might be a very gnomic truth, like if you're watching an action adventure film or fantasy film where we don't think any of it is really real, but it's the nature of human experience that is being unpacked, that's real. If it's a historical film, we think that the general history is real, and this is a bridge that we're constructing to help us wrap our minds around something which actually is so vast and dense that we could never actually process it. Like, there's no way I could take account of 6 million names and faces and identities, so I have to have, as it were, a stand-in for it, right? So I think what's going on with this Malka is like that. It's like the mystery of Christ is, if you're a Christian, is the ultimate mystery, right? How the infinite becomes incarnate, how God becomes man, right? And that how life gives itself in death, over to death on the cross. And you could never, as it were, adequately paint or hymn or wax eloquent about this mystery. Every effort brings you to the threshold of a kind of speechlessness. So sometimes gestures take the place of speech in concretizing the desire to make, for that history to remain real. And I think that's what's going on here, that by adding this leaven, they're saying every Eucharist is one Eucharist, which is actually dogmatic teaching of all the churches, right? There's only one Eucharist, but every Eucharist participates in that Eucharist. We don't have priests offering sacrifices again and again and again. The Epistle to the Hebrews makes this very clear. That's the difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, is that we don't just have a new system of clergy doing a new version of the same old thing. Priests offering, victims in altars in temples. I explained all this on the first day. No, in that sense, what Schmemann says, that Christianity is the end of sacrifice, the end of cult. And so what then is going on is that there's a singular event, and every iteration of it is a participation in that. In that sense, you could find a more perhaps charitable interpretation of to say, even if this didn't actually happen, we can see why people might want to make use of a tradition like this in order to make sure that they are aware that they're not doing something new, but that they are in continuity with what has been done for 2,000 years. Especially the further away you get from the founding events of the gospel, the more people feel the need to develop mechanisms to represent those founding events. The whole culture of pilgrimage does not start in the 2nd century. It's really in the 4th century when you get people, now that the events of salvation are starting to fade from living memory, and people who speak cultures and languages who are not part of the original founding community start to say, well, Nazareth, where's Nazareth? Jerusalem, where's Jerusalem? Bethlehem, what's in Bethlehem? What's a temple? I've never seen the Jewish temple or even the ruins of it, right? So by going on pilgrimage, you say, oh, wow, these things really happened in a specific time and place, right? And so you get all these, and with the peace of the church, it becomes possible then to build all these churches. St. Helen goes around building all these churches. You read a wonderful novel by Evelyn Waugh called Helena. It's a sort of fanciful but great gripper, page-turner account of St. Helen, the mother of Constantine. and includes her, exploits in the Holy Land and building the churches and everything. So that's some fun summer reading for you if you're looking for that. Evelyn Waugh, W-A-U-G-H, great English Catholic novelist, 20th century. And so we have the development at the same time of the liturgical year fills in, the pilgrimage sites fill in, and traditions like this develop, right? They're all just various ways of expressing, on the human side, the desire to remain conscious of the continuity of the past, that Jesus, the events of the Gospels do not become like Star Wars, something that happened long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, but something to which we ourselves in our own time and place are connected. There was a practice called the fermentum, in which bishops would send portions of their Eucharist to other bishops, who would then receive that at the moment that they receive communion, and then take a portion of the loaf they consecrated and send that back, right? And so when we talk about churches being in communion with each other, we usually think of them con-celebrating, clergy con-celebrating. So the Pope of Rome can con-celebrate the Divine Liturgy or the Roman Mass with Patriarch Sviatoslav, or with the head of any of the any Eastern Catholic priest can celebrate with any other Catholic priest. Any Catholic priest can con-celebrate with any other Catholic priest the Eucharist. But of course, in times past, people didn't necessarily all travel, and people going to other places and con-celebrating the Divine Liturgy in a tradition not their own was not the most frequent way that people demonstrated that they were in communion. This practice of the fermentum was more common. And that again gives you some idea of how important, things are, gestures, right? We tend to think that church unity is about us agreeing conceptually, right, on doctrine, propositionally. And I'm not saying that that's not important, but that even that discursive dimension, people felt the need to express that ritually, and that was equally, or if not more important. Does that make sense? So in any event, that's the Malka and Utaf develops this more in that article, which you will have read. It seems that this church, which it's in its heyday was the most geographically spread out of the churches, would have needed a mechanism like that to maintain a sense of solidarity among its faithful, far flung from India to China to Iraq. Beautiful sunset happening now. The structure of
Brian, sorry,
Yep.
just before we get past the Malka, is that particular conception of the Malka unique to the East Syrians?
Yeah,
It's not West Syrian?
No, West Syrians don't have it. No, and the Chaldeans got rid of it, so the East Syrians are the only one who preserve it.
Okay.
So East Syrian church is kind of like a museum piece in the sense that it preserves things that are not there at all in the other churches. It sounds bad to put it that way, because every church every church needs to be a church, not a museum. But it shows how, part of what excites and sort of motivates people who do Eastern Christian studies is a real sense that what we're working with is the common patrimony of all Christendom, and that if we don't take care of these things, as it were, of the knowledge, and have a respect for the communities that conserve these practices, we will all ultimately be the poorer, because we'll be losing a piece of our own history. And of course, the less historically conscious you are, the less you probably care about how much history is lost. And the more conscious you become, the more it seems, wow, this is not something that we would want to lose, because we learn something from it, and it reveals something to us about our faith, even if we don't actually have that self-same practice. Right, structure of the Qurbana. Unfortunately, the Chaldean Catholics and Assyrian Church of the East have somewhat parted ways, because the Chaldean Catholics have pursued a path of liturgical reforms, catalyzed by similar, obviously, dynamics in the West. I don't want to, it's quite nuanced, the differences, and so I don't want to cast two aspersions right off the bat. To my reading, there are many intelligent aspects of the reform, many things that they actually did on a textual level that they got right, in terms of sorting out bits and pieces of things, flotsam and jetsam, as it were, that had sort of cluttered the liturgy and this sort of restoring something of a more pristine order that nonetheless preserved the genius of the tradition. But I am concerned about the loss of things like the use of the curtain, which I think, just as we have Greek Catholics still who don't have iconostases in their churches, really compromises the logic of the liturgy, as does the loss of the eastward position that, when praying to God. And you won't see that really in the text of the Korbana that I posted. I mean, you can read the rubrics, but you'd have to sort of see a liturgy actually celebrated to notice some of these differences. In some sense, the textual differences are less important than the ritual differences. As soon as you turn the language of celebration, the position of the celebrant, the use of things like the curtain, whether you sing or not, and use incense, and all those things are much more immediately appreciable than nuances of whether you've skipped a prayer or added a prayer, or skipped a reading or added a reading or a hymn or whatnot, right? So although for the study of liturgy, we very often start with the script, that is the liturgical text, we should never delude ourselves and think that the liturgical text is the liturgy. It's quite possible that a community has a given book, and two communities using the exact same book, enact it, perform it completely differently, right? And you would think, you wouldn't know unless you knew, you wouldn't know that it's the same thing. That's how important non-verbal languages are in thinking about worship. Language of the senses, of sight and sound and touch and gesture, art, architecture, all of those things. Okay, so the preparation of the gifts, as we've seen with most Eastern liturgies, opening doxology, they actually have a holy, holy, holy at the beginning of the liturgy. The Lord's Prayer with interpolated verses, opening of the veil and the clergy descending from the tonke, the holy place, to the nave, to this hymn that I'll show you momentarily, La Kumara. It's sort of the standard fixed opening, the way we have the only begotten Son, and the Armenians have that. The Trisagion, not addressed to Christ, right? These are not Oriental Orthodox. It's not addressed to Christ. There's no who was crucified for us, just sung the way, actually, how Byzantines sing it. Readings from the Law and Prophets, although these seem to have been lost by the Chaldeans, but held on by the Assyrians. Psalms, then Epistle, Alleluia, and Gospel. And mind you, that reading from the Old Testament in the Eucharist is unique to the Assyrian tradition, to the Syrian traditions. The Syriac, West Syrian, East Syrian preserve readings from the Old Testament in the liturgy. The Copts, Ethiopians, Byzantines, Armenians, and Latins, until recently, only had epistles and Gospels, and the other scriptures are read at other services. Litanies, and then a procession with the gifts back to the holy place.
I just want to ask you what the first Lord's Prayer means.
So that means that if you go and look at the, read that Chaldean Catholic Korbana, you'll see it's sort of, they take like, Our Father who art in heaven, and then they put in a verse from somewhere else. Our Father who art in heaven.
Like parsed? Okay.
Parsed means like stuffed. Yeah. So it's like with food, you can do that too. Like you can stuff a turkey. So this takes a familiar text and breaks it up and stuffs other texts in it. And that has the effect of, hermeneutically speaking, of making of each text interprets the other. Something similar when in the Byzantine tradition, when we have our fixed psalms, for example, at Vespers, O Lord, I cry to you, hear me, O Lord, right? And then every day we have special hymns that get stuffed in between verses of the psalms, in which then the psalm is interpreting the hymn and the hymn is also interpreting the psalm.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. We give you thanks, O Lord of all. We glorify you, Jesus Christ. You raise our bodies. Oops, there we go. You raise our bodies into life. You are the savior of our souls. This is their fixed opening hymn. And it concludes with, as a couple other psalm verses, and they repeat it. And then this prayer, Lord, you are truly the one who raises our bodies, the good savior of our souls, and the constant guardian of our lives. It is thus our duty to thank, adore, and glorify you, who are Lord of all forever. It's beautiful. Prayer is he actually doesn't pray for anything. Again, it's like I said yesterday, it's just a sort of statement of praise, and that's all it is. It's just sort of like, God, you're great. It's wonderful that we can praise you. And that's all we have to say about that. And then we go on. Yes, please, Juliana.
I'm sorry. I know we read these prayers that you take out from the different liturgies, and maybe I'm just blind to this. They all seem similar to me. I am not knowledgeable enough to see how these pieces are very different from anything that I've experienced. Like I don't know.
Well,
Like if you read this, I wouldn't be able to tell you if this was from the Byzantine or from the. I don't know if I have to.
That's just that's a question of familiarity. Like if somebody tells you they like classical music, it could include everything from Bach to Arvo Pärt, right? But if you know, the more you know music, you'll know that, well, then that's not all classical music. That classical music is like Haydn and Mozart, Bach is Baroque, Arvo Pärt is holy minimalism, right? So the more you become familiar, the more you'll see both the similarities, because of course these are all Christian liturgies, everyone is using the scriptures, and in fact hymns are often borrowed by one tradition or another. So there are many common elements that will get shared and borrowed and reappropriated and slightly modified and recycled and so forth, but there are distinctive things as well. Byzantine prayers, for example, are rarely that short. Byzantine prayers are very prolix, as are the Armenian. And if you look at a Byzantine prayer book, you'll see that any of the prayers at the ambo, after the prayers at the ambo, at the end of the Divine Liturgy, for example, they're about 2 to 3 times, or if not more, 4 times even as long as that. So there is a kind of genius to each tradition that is tied to its language, its experience, its climate, its environment, the church fathers and the writings who are being appropriated, privileged parts of the scriptures, and part of that it's a diversity that you just want to enjoy. In other words, you don't need to sort of make up your mind like whether you don't need to make a decision in this respect, but it is helpful to kind of develop a sensitivity, and it does take time though. Like if you read the entirety of the liturgy there, that's why I've posted at least one version, one recension of each tradition, you'll begin to see what I mean. It's not just individual prayers, it's the way things are grouped, and it's the degree of repetition. There's a number of things that go into making a tradition have the kind of logic that it does, that it's like a language. Somebody comes in, starts to speak another language, they may be saying something in a grammatically correct manner, but they don't have a feel for the language. Or the same thing happens with ritual. The more you get into something, the more then you'll sort of understand the implicit logic for it, of it, and the text will not simply be what I'm showing you now, but you'll be able to situate it vis-a-vis the ritual that sort of brings it alive. And so again, that's where watching these videos, that's about the best we can do right now, probably for most of you. But the idea of you going in person, maybe later this summer when the church is open, you could do as a follow-up for yourself, go to some of these churches and even maybe go to the actual tradition that you end up using for your observation paper, go to some local expression of that as a way of filling in your learning, because there will be a penny will drop if you go 2 months from now to an Assyrian liturgy and you've spent some time studying this. It may not make a lot of sense now, but you'll go there and you're like, oh, I get it. I get why this is what it is different, So we have washing of the hands, which one has in not all, but many traditions, drawing of the veil, transfer of the gifts, and the Nicene Creed in a slightly different recension, and the exchange of the peace, and then commemoration of the departed, living and departed. Notice that here you have the commemorations of the living and departed not after the consecration, which would be the example of the Armenians and Copts, but actually before. This is actually an older, this is a very old structure that we have represented in this tradition. Then we have the anaphora, which is somewhat confusing if you're used to other Eucharistic prayers where there seems to be a logic to, okay, first we praise God the Father, then we commemorate Christ the Son, and then we invoke the Holy Spirit. That's the Antiochian style, which is now also used in the variable, the alternate Eucharistic prayers in the Roman Rite, 2, 3, and 4. Although there is a slight difference because they put the anaphora, the epiclesis at the beginning, right after the praise of God, before they go into the anamnesis. But generally, the structure is something you can follow quite easily. Here, the structure is more cyclical. Right? The priest offers a kushapa, that's a supplication, a prayer for divine mercy. Then there's a prayer for himself that acknowledges his unworthiness to be doing what he's doing. And then a glorification of God. And as these three different kinds of prayers they don't repeat, but and then another series like that. And as it moves forward, you get the story of salvation being told, and then oblique references to the Lord's Supper without ever an exact quoting of the words of Christ, as I've already said. The fraction rite is very elaborate. And this is something which, again, is how truth is present in gestures. The breaking of the bread and the signing with pieces of the bread, signing with pieces of the cross, and the holding of the bread over the chalice, these manual actions, which to somebody who's not interested in this just seems like who cares? But it's a way of like making an icon almost in gesture. It's a way of pointing to that physicality is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about God took a body, right? And so the fleshiness of it, the very particularity of the manual actions, it kind of slows the whole thing down, and it draws your attention to the gravitas of what is transpiring. The priest doesn't just sort of take the bread, say something, and just pop it in your mouth and away you go. No, that would be horribly irreverent. If this is a sacrifice, it's an unbloody sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice, right? So that once the gifts have been consecrated before they're distributed, there is this sort of there are these manual actions that can be more or less complicated depending on the tradition. Even in the Latin rite, there's the breaking of the host, and a small portion of it has to be put into the chalice, right? And that is called the comminution, because you're reuniting the body and blood, right? Christ's body and blood they're separate, bread and wine, but then they're in some way have to be combined to represent the unity of Christ, right? And that's what's going on here. We in the Byzantine Rite we mix all of the gifts together in the chalice, right, for the people. The Latin rites put a small portion. There's different ways of doing it, but the principle is that the very actions of the liturgy sort of dramatize the movements of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. I have mentioned several times that this is the oldest Eucharistic prayer we have. People were free to improvise for many centuries, and eventually some of these improvisations get fixed and then inspire others. Scholars have argued that not only is this old, but it actually explicitly preserves the structure of early Jewish prayer. Now, we don't have many documents showing us how Jews prayed at the time of Christ. We have sort of oblique evidence, but the first sort of Jewish prayer book is actually from the 9th century. But this is supposedly three moments of blessing, thanksgiving, and supplication are reflected in the kushapa, but not in that order. So in the canone, in the kushapa and the gahanta and the canone. You can read more in Bradshaw and Johnson if you want to, again, understand some of these nuances a bit better. The East Syrian church is obviously not very ornate, not very elaborate, and there's not a lot of old ones. A lot of them have been destroyed over time because of the many wars that were fought over in Mesopotamia, throughout the Middle East. Often they look like fortresses, stone, and even built right into the rock or built on a hill, on a cliff. Sometimes you have to use a ladder even just to get into the church. And they did not have, under Islam, the freedom to be able to adorn the outside of their churches with crosses, or, you know, even with the bare cross, the way that other churches in other places were able to do. I like this idea of the house of prayer, the Beth Slutha, which I think under COVID, we need to bring this back. Like every church should have like an outdoor courtyard with an outdoor altar. And we could start by having outdoor services spaced 6 feet apart. Maybe we'll just do that all summer long while it's hot and, you know, not have to go back into the church. I asked our priest, was talking with him about this, and he's like, yeah, but I just don't know how we're going to distribute communion if we did an outdoor liturgy. I said, how about we just do outdoor vespers, you know, outdoor matins, like just non-Eucharistic services just to start, which is actually what they did. They would do the Kurbana, this Eucharist always had to be done in the altar, but outdoors they would do the liturgy of the hours, which doesn't require as much, you know, concern for spilling or dropping or anything like that. Again, I'm sorry, these photos aren't particularly revelatory, but this is what I have. This is, oops, what happened there? Low doorways, and the symbolism is that everyone has to be humble to enter the church. And same thing with taking off, I don't know why that's going off the screen, but I just said there that you have to take off your shoes to go into the church. This is this just comparison to see sort of the inspiration in modern architecture. One of the things that all of the Eastern churches have to think through is when they get away from their place of origin and they have, for example, the freedom and the resources to build new churches, what do they do in a pluralist society to sort of say we are unique, right? And if you look at Ukrainian Catholic churches in Canada, I find it's quite interesting. You have some that have sort of distinguished themselves from Orthodox churches by adopting a much more Latin style of architecture. Then you've some that gone like St. Elias in the other direction that are going to sort of find like the wooden church structures of Ukraine, which are so beautiful, the country churches, of which there's not very many in Canada. And they found this classic expression of Ukrainian architecture and then built something in Canada that looks like that. And that really is quite different in being very, very traditional. And then you've got things in the middle like Holy Eucharist where Noel goes, where they've got icons are all done in a cubist style. It's like what Picasso would have done if he had done icons. And it's meant to sort of express, I think, the fact that, hey, we're Canadian, we're modern people, we can experiment. And just like Roman Catholics can experiment with different styles of art and architecture, we Ukrainian Catholics are not stuck in one model of art architecture we can explore. Maybe Noel can send a link to some of the Cubist icons there. What's the name of the iconographer who did the icons at that church? Do you know, Noel?
I do not know, Brian.
Yeah,
honestly, I don't know.
Look that up and put that in the chat or the discussion. I think people,
okay.
If you've never seen that. It's clearly a Byzantine church, but he's really pushing the boundaries as to what makes an icon, yeah? So with the Assyrian churches, they are not, for example, allowed to use any sacred art, only the bare cross. But I have it on authority from a colleague who visited them that all the women who wear veils, as is the case in most Eastern churches, have veils with images of Mary on them. So they're like, well, we can't put icons on the wall, but no one said we can't put an icon on a veil on our head, you know? And so there's sort of like a way of sort of saying, yeah, we like all those images. And the priest said, no, but we're the one church that doesn't do that. So we got to hold on to sort of the, a very Spartan sort of arrangement because that's sort of our shtick, that's our genius. And they're like, okay, well, but we really want to have images. How can we kind of find a way to do that, right? So here is an attempt to sort of say, we are in continuity with the ancient Mesopotamian architecture, right? There are these ancient temples, and we're going to build a church that evokes that, and that way demonstrate that we're not, this passing through the period of Islam. That has no bearing on our identity. One of the most distinctive features of the Eastern Church, Syrian churches, was this use of a bema that comes directly from the synagogue. And if you were in a synagogue, there would be the ark at the far end where you would hold the scrolls of the scriptures. And then in the middle, you'd have a raised platform from which you would read and chant and preach. And early churches, and you can see this, Pope Benedict writes beautifully of this in the book called The Spirit of the Liturgy, combined the architecture of the Jewish home, the temple, and the synagogue. Why? Because you had the division of the nave where the liturgy of the word would happen, and this is the case in traditional Syrian churches too, where there's a Bema. In Constantinople, we called it the ambon, same concept. So the liturgy of the word is centered in the nave around a fixed structure from which you preach, sing, and read. And then the liturgy of the Eucharist happens in the east end, where you have an altar, a table, like, in other words, it's a temple. So you have the altar, but you have a table because it's a meal, not a bloody sacrifice. And the veil then symbolizes also that this is a temple. This is the holy place, a kanke, as we've seen in all the Eastern churches have some type of partition. So that sort of dialectic between the place for the liturgy of the word and the place for the liturgy of the Eucharist, there've been various attempts to sort of recover that in modern Western architecture, where often they will give a lot of attention to the ambo, right, as the place from which the scriptures are read and the homily is preached, versus the altar. You have churches in the West where they've tried to put the altar in the middle of the church. That is without precedent in historical churches. But the idea there was to sort of shake things up. And what was a precedent was having a bema in the middle of the church, not the altar, but they have done that in some places, as you've probably been in churches where they've tried that. You did only places you would have that traditionally, or where in some instances you'd have like a church built over a martyr's tomb or something, where it was circular and the altar was sort of necessarily right over the tomb. For example, in St. Peter's, it's like that. So the altar is actually built over the crypt where St. Peter's buried, and the rest of the church kind of goes on around it. But historically, people would have not been on all four sides of the altar, but only on three sides. So here you have this bema on which there's a table, a place for the gospel, the cross, and two lecterns to distinguish the readings from the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Here's the church in Baghdad. You can sort of see they don't have a proper bema, but they do have the two lecterns in the bottom left there, and they have the extended kestroma, which is like a arsolea, so a place where the bema has basically been shoved up close to the curtain, but they still have the lecterns that symbolize the two covenants. Much of this, these architectural features then get passed into Greek and other usage. In Constantinople, as we'll see later this week, there was also a gated walkway that led from the altar to the ambo, like a shakakona, and there was so distinct place for both different parts of the liturgy. Again, all of this stuff is being sort of revisited, reinvented. In the West, people buy borrowed churches from other denominations and they adapt them more or less successfully. Sometimes people say, they go one direction, say, we're modern people, we don't need any of this stuff, and we'll build a church that looks like, you know, an evangelical church maybe, and make it very open, very accessible, etc. And then you'll have people who will go the other way and say, no, hey, there's something really beautiful in this tradition, let's revive it. So let's bring back these things that we've lost and build a church that has a bema. And you can find both examples in most traditions. You can find people who want to explore the history as a place from which to derive inspiration for the present, and others who prefer to mark out, to have something that shows similarity with the culture where they are and the kinds of buildings that are around them. This is something similar to our tetrapod, and you'll notice the terminology, if you're familiar with the Hebrew, if you've done some study of the Old Testament, the glory of God that covered the tabernacle is called the Shekinah. And this same word, feminine word, shkinta, glory, is what they call the thing like our tetrapod where you put the cross. And that's what you do when you go into East Syrian churches, you venerate the cross. There's no icons to kiss, but you venerate the cross. And you also venerate the martyrs. And we've already seen the importance of the martyrs, the dust from the martyr's tomb in the wedding service. This sign of the cross is a sacrament, one of the holy mysteries, a raza, for the Assyrian Church of the East. And again, it points to the importance of gesture. Like I remember when as a Protestant, it always seemed strange to me that Catholics would, make the sign of the cross. I didn't understand that. Like, what's the point? Can't you just pray with your hands in like any way you like? And of course you can. But the more, the older you get, maybe you realize this, that how much gesture is meaningful, right? Body language, the way you look at people, the way you embrace, or now we're not allowed to embrace anybody, but like all of that stuff, like bodiliness matters. And so the making of the signing of the cross on one's body becomes, in all the Catholic and Apostolic churches, a very rich and evocative symbol and an integral part of both personal prayer and public prayer. And even, I mean, the Byzantines get down to sort of the way you use your fingers, whether it's the old believers like this, or, everybody else, like with three representing Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and the two natures, Chalcedonian Christology being represented by the two fingers, right? And the way that the priest, the gestures of the priest is meant to symbolize when he's blessing the first two letters of Christ's name and all this kind of stuff, So we get kind of layers upon layers of symbolism. And I think the proper way to approach that is to say that there is a more holistic understanding of how you transmit knowledge in the past than perhaps we have today, where we privilege the cognitive and the discursive. And in the past, people understood rather that things are taught, things that piety is caught, not taught, right? You catch piety, you catch the drift, you catch an ethos. It spreads like a disease, as it were, rather than simply a message that is delivered discursively.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Can you tell me the idea of making the sign of the cross being a sacrament? Does that mean that they do it less?
No, that means that they I mean, words are words, or things and things are things, as Taft likes to say. So if you start off with a Western definition of sacrament, it may not make a lot of sense, right? Like a physical thing that represents an invisible grace. Because when they say the sign of the cross, they mean both you making the sign of the cross, but also the making of crosses, right? Like the cross, which any wooden cross participates in virtue of its similarity to the cross. So the cross, the representing of the cross, is a mystery, and a mystery for them, reza, is a thing that manifests the sacred, it's a hierophany, right? It opens up. Think of the Paul Evdokimov article. It's an opportunity to enter into sacred time, sacred space. So by making the sign of the cross, which is done very frequently in all the Eastern services, you are continually using your own body to remind yourself of the one who used his body, right, to save you, right? You're marking on your person, as it were, the very means of salvation. And in that sense, to the extent that the cross is at the heart of Christianity in every possible way, right? And so to make the sign of the cross is to both acknowledge, is to, as it were, make a embodied articulation of the creed, which we say, he became man, and for our sake he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, etc. All of that's being summarized, or it's sublimated in a sense when you make the sign of the cross, and it's using your body to orient your person to God. And so in that sense, they see it as something sacred, both the doing of it, the venerating of it, the making of it, in that, and in that sense, you couldn't distinguish Christianity and Islam more sharply than that. We have lots of things in common, Christianity and Islam, don't get me wrong, and I mentioned a bunch of practices already that were borrowed by Muslims from Christians, but the cross is really what divides Christianity and Islam. Muslims, the Quran says Jesus, never mind rose from the dead, he wasn't even crucified, right? The Quran says it was made to look that way to them, but God put someone else in Jesus' place because he wouldn't have allowed one of his prophets to suffer this ignominious death. And to the extent that the cross represents not only the way in which God deals with sin and death, but it implicitly expresses the mystery of the Trinity, which the Quran also contradicts explicitly. Like there's no threeness in God, there's no plurality in God, etc. And that's a big, big heresy and a big no-no, a sacrilege, real blasphemy, really, which is why you get Muslims from time to time erupting in bouts of vicious persecution of Christians over so-called blasphemy, because of the belief either they're accused of insulting Muhammad or of taking persons to God, shirk, right? Expressing plurality. So when you make the sign of the cross, you say in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, or more likely in the Eastern Church, you're frequently saying glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit. By doing that, you're at one and the same time taking the two chief dogmas of the faith, the Trinity and the Incarnation. The Incarnation being something manifest first and foremost in the Passion, not at Christmas. Like there's no Christmas in the Gospel of John. There's no Christmas in the Gospel of Mark, right? There's no infancy narrative. Christmas only makes sense in light of the Paschal mystery. That's where the Incarnation is revealed, and from which we then look backwards and extrapolate on its significance, throughout the entirety of Christ's life. So in that sense, the Paschal mystery and the Trinity are the two core dogmas of the faith. And so it's instructive that in this tradition shows us how these things are not just meant to be things that you talk about or think about, but are meant to be things that you remind yourself of in a very visceral way.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to imagine if, if all of a sudden the sign of the cross, I thought of it as a sacrament, whether I would be doing it differently.
Yeah, well, hey, it's a sacramental, even if you're even in the Western Church, it's a sacramental, so it's not something that should be done lightly or frivolously. And it's sometimes that when I've met Protestants who become Catholic Orthodox, it's one of these big moments when they start to make the sign of the cross. It's almost like, okay, now I'm really getting into this. You know what I mean? It's just sort of like, I was just sort of looking and thinking about it before, but now I'm sort of like complicit, like I'm sort of doing what people are doing, and there's no going back. And at first people often do it in a very discreet way, like, I don't know if I'm doing it properly or whatever, but then, if you hang out with Byzantine Christians, you get this extremely dramatic sort of, signs of the cross. Copts will do it in a very, 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 very quickly, kind of almost even the priests in a very perfunctory manner, whereas Slavs love to make these big signs of the cross and like big bows, so yeah, different cultural sense.
Because in a way, it's almost like the creed, right? You're saying something when you do it.
Yes, exactly. And that's the same idea with, the wearing of a neck cross. I mean, keep in mind that we're talking about the most gruesome form of crucifixion that the ancient world knew. It's not at all obvious, even to us today. We think of the beauty of the cross. We have all sorts of hymns and prayers about this, exaltation and so forth. But it's not at all obvious that something so horrific would become an object of beauty and something that you want to be reminded of all the time, right? There might be versions of Christianity which try to sort of avoid talking about that. Oh, there were, which is why you get something like the Gospel of Thomas, which is a Gnostic gospel. It says really cool things about Jesus and sayings of Jesus, but has no passion, death, and resurrection. It's like, kind of like Jesus as this mystical guru teacher. We weren't interested in his miracles and what he teaches, but we don't need any dying, rising thing, right? And that has always been something that demarcates authentic Christianity from other things, is if they somehow go around the passion rather than through it.
Sorry, just to follow up on that.
Yeah.
So the Chaldean and the Syro-Malabar Catholics would would have a different system of sacraments then.
Exactly.
So
Yeah,
their
there you go.
theology is different than the rest of the tradition.
Yeah. So that's the cognitive dissonance, you see, and that's what closer to home. That's what Eastern Orthodox will say about Greco-Catholics. They're like, well, how do you guys pray the same liturgy as us, and then you go around and believing all these things? The Roman Catholics believe about X, Y, Z, filioque, purgatory, azymes, whatever, and Immaculate Conception, whatever. And that's where what's right in that, like what's I think legitimate, is that yes, your theology should flow from your prayer, and your prayer should reflect your theology. What's missing in that is the recognition that there's always been a plurality of theologies and always been a plurality of ways of praying, right? So when Orthodox say, well, you guys believe something that's different than what you pray, the proper answer is we acknowledge the legitimacy of a system of belief that is tied to a way of praying that we see as complementary to our own, and from which we learn and we can appropriate, while nonetheless maintaining the integrity of our own forms of faith and practice. Just like I can be an English speaker and use words from French or other things that are actually very expressive without changing the grammar of my language. But it's also possible to become in a situation where you lose your language and end up speaking a kind of pidgin form of it because, you know, a child who's raised in an environment where maybe there's no coherent kind of, you know, language community, and then they don't really know, maybe they're caught between two languages and they don't know how they go together. Yes, you can imagine that, and that has happened to us in our history. So yes, this is the thing that then Chaldean Catholics and say Syro-Malabars, and I'll mention this momentarily, have had to thrash out, is how do we be faithful to our Syriac tradition, presuming, number one, and this is already a theological principle, that fidelity to the past is a good, right? Because you notice that the Second Vatican Council oscillates between talking about ressourcement and aggiornamento, right? Should you go backwards? That's a ressourcement, to the sources. Or should you adapt to the world around you? That's the aggiornamento, right? And so it's not just Western Christians who have to sort that out. Eastern Christians too have to say, when they come into communion with Rome, wow, Thomas Aquinas makes a lot of sense to me. Is he maybe more on the ball than, say, Babai the Great from the 7th century? He's a great teacher of the East Syrian Church. Maybe Thomas Aquinas' account of the sacraments is more coherent, more persuasive, more grounded, more whatever. And so you get people in the very act of being educated come back to their ritual tradition, having studied theology, say in the West, having read Aquinas, having read Byzantine rite or something, and they have to still use a liturgy which in the past was used and formed by people who did not have those same theological influences, right? Because they were in communion with those people, so they were maybe not reading what they wrote and were interested, right? So that is partly a larger question that you just, again, there's no answer, but I invite you to think about, is this the nature of tradition? What makes a tradition coherent? How many things can you add in from other places before something doesn't really make sense, a tradition doesn't really make sense anymore? And the Syro-Malabar have had the added challenge of saying, we don't just want to be faithful to the Syriac tradition, and we want to be faithful to the Catholic Communion, but we want to be authentically Indian. And therefore, to the extent that the Syriac tradition or the Catholic faith need to somehow wear Indian vesture, speak Malayalam, then they need to be adapted. And so this is one of the things that's a fun thing for people who do study theology. I mean, at what point can there be new theology? At what point can you write something new that's actually true? Or has everything true already been said, right? Has Thomas Aquinas had the last word, or do we need new people to write new works of sacramental theology that sort of bring all these things together? And if so, is it possible that maybe they get it wrong? Maybe they go too far with, say, the syncretism. And then we've seen many examples from India, for example, of modern theologians who go so far in the attempt to sort of bridge Christianity and Hinduism, say, that other people are worried that they're losing something of the, you know, the distinctiveness of the Christian faith, much more, and certainly of, say, a particular liturgical heritage. So it's that's a really, really good question. And ecumenical dialogue brings this up, right, to a Catholic, Chaldean Catholic who's involved, and they are now on the ecumenical dialogue with the Assyrian Church of the East, wants to say, is caught between, always wanted to play both sides, saying, yeah, I'm with those guys when it comes to the integrity of the tradition, but I am in communion with these guys and I recognize the value of this. And so one of the challenges in the ecumenical dialogue with the Assyrian Church of the East has been, can we agree to have different numbers of sacraments? And the conclusion was, yeah, we can, because actually the numbering of the sacraments is a very late thing. that never, you know, in the first millennium, nobody was trying to number the sacraments. The idea was that everything the church did is sacramental, because the church is a sacrament filled with the Holy Spirit, the bride of Christ, and all the actions of the church, all her blessings, all her actions of sanctifying people, places, things, are all one big set series of blessings, which is why still today in the Byzantine Rite, we have a big trebnik, right? We have a big book of blessings that's got everything from blessing a car to baptizing a child. It's in the same book, right? On the other hand, there's a certain value onto saying, well, Jesus did sort of privilege a few special things. He might have been happy with us blessing Easter baskets, but he kind of wanted us to do this communion thing pretty regularly, you know, and like the baptism thing. And like, so it's important also to have some kind of hierarchy. And that's where the Assyrian Church of the East clearly has a reverence for marriage, but they just didn't reach a point where they thought that marriage has to be listed next to like the Holy Communion and baptism, you see? And many Protestants would be in that situation too, which is actually instructive. I mean, ecumenical dialogue with Protestants also involves that question. If you only believe in two ordinances, say as Baptists and others would, so communion and even, you know, low church Anglicans even would just be the communion and baptism, how do those people come to appreciate the value of holy orders, anointing of the sick? Even they all value marriage, obviously, but do they look at it as a sacrament or as, you know, as a civil institution that's then blessed by God? So all of these things are moving targets. They're not things that you can, or that we can perhaps nail down exactly, but that's exactly the right kind of question to be asking. And trust me, people are thinking about that. If you read, there's a lot of good liturgists among the Indian churches, and they're always writing on these questions about culture and like, you know, interreligious dialogue and relating different ritual traditions together and trying to find what do we have to have in common, what can we have as difference, what is the norm, who decides what's normative, right? And it's messy, don't get me wrong, it's messy, and many people want to retreat, especially in a parish context, want to say, whoa, this is all too complicated. Just keep it simple for me. Tell me what's black and white and let's keep it like that. Who's the heretics? Who are the good guys? You know, who are the bad guys? You know, like, and that's okay for ordinary people, but for you theologians, students of theology, you need to realize it is going to be a little bit more messy than that. And that's us Greek Catholics, we're figuring that out, right? I don't pray the Filioque in our church, and I would not like it if someone expected me to do that in our church. But I conduct Gregorian chant and Renaissance polyphony in a Roman Catholic church in town that does like a solemn Novus Ordo. And when we sing the creed in Latin, I did, you know, qui ex patre filioque procedit. I have no problem singing the Filioque in Gregorian chant or in a mass by Palestrina. I'm not gonna like take it out, right? It belongs in the music. But we don't do that when we sing the creed in our church. And I can imagine Orthodox saying, oh, what? So like you believe in the Holy Spirit when you're at St. George's at 9 a.m. and by the time you get to St. John the Baptist at 11:30, you don't believe in that anymore? The Spirit double procession? No, of course not. It's like when I speak Ukrainian, I don't try to make all the nouns, I don't try to take the gender off of all of the nouns. And when I'm English, I don't try to put gender onto the nouns. I recognize that different languages work differently, and you can speak more than one language. You can articulate your thoughts in two different languages. They're the same thoughts, but they're articulated differently, but they come from the same person. And so I think the linguistic metaphor is helpful, not just for understanding language, but liturgy, but also even for understanding theology as systems of meaning, which are true and which aim at truth, but which never exhaust the truth, right? One can have a purchase on the truth without exhausting it. And I think that's part of the beauty too of these multiple liturgical traditions is they capture something of the meaning of the faith without owning it, without totalizing it. And I think it's a good Christian thing of Christian humility for every tradition to sort of say, we have purchase on this truth without claiming that everyone else has to have it in exactly the same way as us. That is, I think, again, a fundamental difference of Christianity and Islam. Not to pick on Islam tonight, but Christianity right from the beginning said, let's translate the Bible into all these languages. Is that going to create confusion? You bet. Is it going to be like the Tower of Babel all over again? Sort of. That's why we don't understand each other at the ecumenical councils. But the risk of that is worth running vis-a-vis saying everyone has to speak Greek
have the exact same liturgy, worship in the exact same way, because that's the only way we'll all have one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. No, we believe in a God who is one in three, so the church has to manifest also unity and diversity. Not uniformity, not division, but unity and diversity. Okay, just in closing tonight, a little bit about Indian Christianity. We'll talk
Can
more
I ask
tomorrow.
a question? Sorry, about St. Thomas.
Yeah.
Who is this? This is not the St. Thomas, the doubting Thomas.
You bet.
It is.
That's the one.
I can see
that you're doubting. Yeah, I can see that you're doubting, Juliana.
Is this the same guy who did
You
the St. Thomas Gospels?
You bet. No.
Is there an irony there that he didn't talk about the?
No, he didn't. He did not write the Gospel of Thomas. Okay.
He did.
I don't know.
No one knows who wrote the Gospel
People
of
in the
Thomas.
ancient world would attribute things to people left, right, and center. It doesn't mean that you can't trust. There's a Gospel of Mary. It was not written by Mary. There's a Gospel of Peter. It was not written by Peter. Even the Gospel of John is a collaborative effort. And, Joshua and other people who studied, biblical studies, they'll tell you about that. So yeah, don't worry about that. But this is the same Thomas. And man, if you'd had an experience of the risen Lord like Thomas did, you might have the gumption to go off to India too, right? So
yeah, but I wouldn't write that book, which didn't mention.
No, he didn't. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. That was Gnostic people who wanted to give it a air of authority that they didn't actually have. So they said, hey, if we said that Thomas wrote this, then maybe people would listen to us. It's like if you were to do what you wouldn't do, Juliana. It's like if you were to go write a paper and then put my name on and say, now I'm going to post this on Facebook. Be like, oh, Brian Butcher wrote this. This must be really worth reading. That would be could be done out of a spirit of both. You want to get me in trouble. Or it could be done out of some kind of admiration, but in both cases, not a good idea. But in the ancient world, they didn't have those qualms. It's like, yeah, I didn't write this, but if I say Thomas did, people will read it. That's great, So
okay, thanks for clarifying. I didn't. I got confused.
It's constantly being debated about the Pauline corpus.
Yeah, that's true too.
And that's a very fractious issue even now. I mean,
that's right.
I mean, everyone's gotten over the idea that Hebrews wasn't written by Paul. We're all okay with that now.
Yeah.
But Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians, which is kind of Gnostic.
Anyway, Joshua will set you straight on that after, Patrick. We got these Anglicans better stand up for something here. We need them to stand up for the canon of Scripture, because all this, we're not, if they don't, who is going to, right? So, okay.
So we destroyed the canon of Scripture.
Okay, so St. Thomas goes to India, preaches to the Jews in India, which I mentioned already. There were Jews in India at the time of Christ, and this church follows the St. Thomas. Hey, look who's that next to Metropolitan Mar Afram, the head of the Chaldean Syrian church in India. Yes, that's the same guy in the picture on the right serving the Qurbana. I got to stay at his house here in this complex at the church in Tlichur and dine with him. Great privilege of my life to meet this beautiful man. He's had a phenomenal ministry. He's been around for decades. He's an institution in India as a whole. And that's saying something. He's 1 billion people in India, but everybody knows this guy. This community was a unified community up until the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century, who, having a lot of the concerns that have been mentioned by different people throughout this course, did not know what to do with these East Syrian people. They thought they were Nestorian, they wanted to burn their books, they wanted them to become Roman Catholics, acknowledge the Pope, etc. The upshot of a lot of conflict, and there's a whole story there that I can't go into, all of it right now, was that the church in India got divided into multiple factions. Some of them retained the original East Syrian liturgy. Some of them embraced the West Syrian tradition, which was also Syriac, because the West Syrian Syriac Orthodox bishops agreed to take them under the wing and help them protect them or defend them from the Portuguese. And then over time, some of those people became Catholic, and I'll talk about them tomorrow. That's the Syro-Malankara Catholic. What unites all of these communities is they all use Syriac. Even there's one that's part of the Anglican Communion called, or in communion with the Anglican Church, the Mar Thoma Syrian Church, which basically has taken the West Syrian liturgy, stripped it of prayers to Mary and prayers for the dead and reading of the deuterocanonical books, etc. But nonetheless still uses Syriac and still uses the basic structure of the service shared with the Orthodox. Even they use a curtain actually too. That happened after the Anglicans started coming in and realized, oh, but there's already Christians here. Maybe we don't need to. They don't need to become Anglican. We can work with them to help them reform their own communities along the lines of, the Reformation theology. When it comes to liturgy, it's really a complex business. They had been greatly Latinized throughout their history, started to restore the more pristine Chaldean heritage, Assyrian heritage, but then were sort of neo-Latinized given the popularity of many of the things in the Novus Ordo, particularly Mass facing the people, always facing the people the entirety of the service, and losing the curtain and that kind of thing. And now it's sort of like a bit of a stalemate. There's half of the Syro-Malabars use a very traditional form of the Qurbana, and there's still a number who still have you would hardly tell the difference between if you from the aesthetics of it, that it wasn't sort of a common Novus Ordo Mass. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we both acknowledge our Catholicity, preserve our Syriac heritage, and open ourselves up to the Indian context? So you get a lot of a very interesting dynamic of composing new music along the lines of Hindu bhajans, so like Hindu devotional songs, using instruments like the sitar and tabla and that kind of thing, which is done in all the Indian churches. But then incorporating that into a tradition which has this whole Syriac chant, hymns of St. Ephrem and so forth. So it's really fascinating. You can see some of this in some of what the readings that I've given you, and you can easily find videos of the Syro-Malabar online. So this is, this is a bit of a takeaway probably from the course. I would hope that you would understand that language and culture, worship is always interacting in complex ways with these things. Right? There's no the Second Vatican Council stated that there are variable and invariable elements, but it didn't say exactly which the variable elements are and which the invariable elements are. And that's why people are it's always something that's in ferment. You've heard the maybe quote, what's the difference between a liturgist and terrorist? Have you heard this? That you can negotiate with a terrorist. Liturgists can be among the most obnoxious people. I include myself in that, because we get so worked up about this stuff. And you got also people like, who cares? It's Jesus, one or the other. As long as I'm hearing the gospel, receiving communion, doesn't matter. Said mass, sung mass, facing east, facing the people, good music, bad music, nice vestments, bad vestments, shorter service, longer service. Who cares? As long as we're praying. That's the point. What two people experience as prayerful can often be very different, right? And so these churches have to figure all this out. We have a Syro-Malabar community, as I said, meeting in our parish, St. John the Baptist. Just one more slide here. And it's such a different aesthetic. And it's really interesting just to see when people wander into our service from that community or vice versa. And there's just a sort of a mutual curiosity, but also sort of a mutual confusion, because they come in and they can't quite figure out what to make of our Byzantine service. And then we go in, and when they're on the microphones and the keyboard, and it's super loud and garish almost. And they had a procession where they had a van in the parking lot with a drum, beating out a drum beat while they were doing a procession on a feast day. And like the whole neighborhood was like shaking. And I was like, I can imagine, I think this is just like, we don't know what to make of this, And they're thinking, well, this is low key in India. We bring out the elephants, we have firecrackers, carrying these umbrellas, they're beating the drums in the streets. So the sense of celebration is expressed in such different ways. Ukrainians love to get excited, but it's when we have the zabava, right? It's like, then we have the party, then we're like dancing and drinking and rolling around and cartwheels and whatever. But in church, no, it's calm and quiet and sober, Well, the Indians, these guys, the Syro-Malabar, they don't drink very much at all. So I think none of the Indian Christians drink a lot. So I think they need to bring the fiesta into those Qurbana. And sometimes it's not obvious how that actually meshes. They wanted the Syro-Malabars to do a pro-life liturgy, part of the circuit. And I said to the Abuna, Father Achan, I said, Father, they want you to do a prayer life, but maybe could we do one with just a cappella, like unplugged, just a chant, you know, without the keyboard and the mic, just this time, just because I think people might be a little bit overwhelmed by how loud it is here, you know. But anyways, lastly, this is a community that I was blessed to visit, and it really encapsulates this the beautiful possibilities. Is a monastic community that's part of the worldwide Benedictine Federation. They are Trappists, so that's the reform of the Cistercians, or reform of the Benedictines. They follow the West Syrian liturgy that we'll study tomorrow, but they make use of Hindu ascetical practices. They wear bare feet, saffron robes, vegetarian, sitting on the floor, you know, meditative prayer, that kind of thing. And I went and spent a little retreat at this monastery, and it was amazing. I mean, these utterly simple, utterly organic. You know, like nothing, everything just fit together in a way that made total sense when you were there. It's like they are Catholic, they're Syriac, and they're Indian. And all of these aspects of their identity just kind of blend very beautifully. They celebrate the Syriac liturgy, but then they'll have devotional singing with little symbols and things like that are just as if it was like in a Hindu temple. It sounds like that, but they're hymns to Christ. This is their church, where they have the curtain and the Indian lamp there in front. And they even have developed a Indian rite of Mass. So they use the liturgy of St. James on Sundays and feast days, and on weekdays they use their own form of Eucharist, which is basically inspired by the Indian, by a puja. If it was interesting, I can send you, I've got the text for it and stuff. They involve sitting on the floor and in flowers and Indian style incense and all the chants and everything about it is it's almost too Indian for most Catholics' liking. In other words, they think it's too Hindu. But because these are monks, people respect that they have a right kind of mindset in doing it. And it's really sort of been at the heart of this conversation over enculturation in the Indian churches. Good, so we will stop with that for today. And any concluding questions or comments, I'll be happy to stick around as usual. I'm sorry for the disruption in this service tonight, the programming with the technology. Anyone need to say anything? Otherwise, we will conclude in prayer. No? Okay. Let us have maybe Natalia. Could you lead us in a closing prayer? It doesn't have to be sung. You can just say if you prefer. You can sing something. Because I've done a lot of the talking and the praying. You'll have to turn your mic on. Yeah.
Yeah. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Can I say it in Ukrainian?
Of course. Just tell people what you're going to say beforehand.
Okay, I'm just going to say the Bohoroditsa Divo, the prayer to the Mother of God. Богородице Діво, радуйся, благодатна Марія, Господь з тобою, благословенна ти між жінками, і благословенний плід лона Твого, бо ти породила Христа, Спаса і Збавителя душ наших. Пресвятая Богородице, спаси нас.
Спаси нас.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Дуже дякую. Great to see everyone. Take care, and we'll see you again tomorrow evening.
Thank you.
Brian,
Thank you.
Brian, can you clarify for me what you said earlier? And you said it in other lectures, but forgive my ignorance about the different positions of the fingers in the signing of the cross.
So most Christians have an open hand when they make the sign of the cross. That's in the West. Also the Copts, Syrians, everybody except the Byzantines has an open hand.
No, are we talking about when a cleric blesses someone else?
No. Okay, no. In that, yes. In many traditions, well, no, actually, now that I think of it, I think it's only the Byzantines who do that too. When priests make the sign of the cross in the Latin West, they just make it's an open hand as well as when people make the sign of the cross.
Yeah.
13 priests make what is meant to be represent the first two letters of Jesus' name. It doesn't, I've never really seen it, but it's meant to be Cairo. So it's meant to be Christos, right? And
Right.
bishops will bless with two hands like that in the Byzantine tradition. The faithful, if you're an old believer, you bless like this. You still believe in the Council of Chalcedon. No, they don't believe in the Trinity too, but they believe in two fingers, sign of the cross. That was a custom, and then the Greeks developed, and in fact, I'm not sure what century this came into vogue, the idea or the practice of having three fingers here, and two fingers here. So three for the Trinity. And
Like holding chopsticks.
yeah, right, yeah. Now, our irony is that the old believers and everybody else in the Byzantine tradition all believe in the same ecumenical councils. No issue of different Christology or anything. They just did not like being told to change the sign of the cross. And Patriarch Nikon in 17th century said, yeah, we're all going to start making the sign of the cross like this. And they said, yeah, you and what army? And he's like, I'll show you what army. And so
God's army.
Yeah. And so there were martyrs who went to the stake because they did not want to change the sign of the cross, and other things too. There were other, aspects of the divine liturgy and the offices that they changed, but it was a hugely contentious thing. And so whenever people, including Orthodox, but not only Orthodox, will talk about sort of the changeless East and the East that's never had the divisions of the West and the Reformation, yeah, take that with a big fat grain of salt, because the reason you could have, when they tried to have like alternate points of view, sometimes Eastern Christians just couldn't tolerate it, so they just got rid of it, those people, or they marginalized them. So the very flourishing of Protestant denominations in the West is partly because of the invention of the printing press, and partly because in the New World there was no one community that was able to kind of control everybody else. Russia became very regimented in that respect after the conflict with the old believers, in kind of expecting a ritual uniformity that's never really been characteristic of other Byzantines. Like the Greeks are very relaxed about this kind of stuff. Like if you go into a Greek church, and I've seen priests who are like in the middle of incensing, and they'll go like shake hands with somebody while they're holding the censer or this kind of thing. Like they just kind of sense in a fairly, just however they feel like doing it. Everything in the Russian church is very highly scripted, like how things are supposed to be done, and it emerged out of this conflict over ritual. So, and there still are old believers today in Erie, Pennsylvania. There's some in Canada, and they will make the sign of the cross very assiduously with those in that manner.
So I in my ignorance, I've been signing myself with the cross now for years without even thinking about what my fingers should or should not be doing.
Oh, well, God bless you. What you should be thinking about is the Lord's sacrifice for you, not about your fingers. So.
But I do consider these things, important. So
Yeah,
I don't know, what should I be doing with my hands?
Well, if you see, it depends what church you want to join. If you want to be with the Maronites, then you maybe don't want to adopt the Byzantine way of doing things. If you want, you should just make the sign of the cross with open hand, but right to left, which is
right to left.
Yeah, well, is that what the Maronites do, or do they do left to right? Actually,
I don't know.
Yeah, so we do right to left, but the West, they do left to right. The Copts do right to left, but with open hand. And who else? I should actually do a little chart so I get this straight in my mind. So there's some do in India, they all do left to right, though. Actually, that's interesting. So the Syriac churches in the Middle East, I think, do right to left, but in India they do left to right. I think that was the Roman Catholic influence. The rationale for that is that when you say in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, in Latin you say Spiritus Sanctus. So the word Sanctus, people had the idea that the word holy should be on the right side because there's a symbolism of right being virtuous and left being evil. And also the symbolism, the sign of the cross that, so we'll start with that. So when you say in the name of the Father, the Son, in nomine Patris et Filii, it's Spiritus Sancti, right? So you should end up on the holy on the right shoulder. Whereas in Greek, you say nomati tu patros ki tu agio pneumatos. So the agio, the holy, comes first. So that way you also end up with holy on the right because you're starting on the right and end up on the left, right? So you say Holy Spirit. Now in English, it's like the Greek, the name of the Father, Son,
I see.
Holy Spirit, because one of the subsidiary meanings of the sign of the cross is that you're symbolizing also that God bring us from the side on the Latin understanding was that he takes us from the left to the right, meaning he takes us from the goats to be with the sheep. He puts away our evil deeds and brings us, remembers our good deeds, right? So they wanted to end up on the right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've always thought about it, and it's not because anyone taught me this. It just made sense from the chain of symbolism that I'm familiar with, that left-handed things are sinister.
Right, of course, so, mano sinistra,
yeah. So if I was in any way privileging my left side, I was being somehow satanic. You know, like, I don't know. I guess my rule of thumb is until I become familiar with the reasons for doing something different, I default, I guess, to doing things the Latin right way.
Sure. Yeah. And I think the Maronites probably do that as well. I would be surprised. They may keep it right to left, but I'm pretty sure they do open hand, and they may even do left to right following Latin influence. But yeah, whatever the Maronites do, I'd suggest if that's the community you're interested in, do that.
Cool.
It's important to do the sign of the cross in one way or another than how exactly you do it. It's like the different liturgies. It's important that the Eucharist be celebrated more than the specific way in which it's celebrated.
Right. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you as always. See you tomorrow.
Yeah. Take care, Julie.
I had a quick question about Gregory of Palamas. Yeah, about Gregory of Palamas. You mentioned him yesterday about, saints who are in and out and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So what's it about him? Because, and the Jesus prayer, that you made an interesting kind of side comment, and I missed it, but is it sort of like people didn't know about the Jesus prayer and he kind of brought it in, and some people didn't like it? Is that?
Well, no, it was more that he lives after the schism, technically after the sort of the mutual anathemas of 1054, right? Because he's living in the 13th and 14th century. So that makes him somewhat suspect on the Latin side just because of that. But the more explicit grounds was that he was stressing the idea of participating in the divine nature and participating in the divine energies. And that was not really, it was not obvious. Today, a lot of work has been done to show this, but it was not obvious to Latin theologians at the time how that could be squared with what Latin scholastic theologians were saying about beatific vision and how we experience created grace. So we don't experience God himself, but we experience God creates a mode whereby we can experience his gifts. That's called created grace. And so the people were unsure what to make of his theology of the divine energies, of the participation in the divine nature, of beholding the uncreated light with our physical eyes, which is what he said could be done. If you were assiduous in prayer, you would actually behold, as it were, what we see in the halo on a sacred image is actually a real thing. Like, it's not just the artist's imagination, right? Yeah. So all of that were reasons why people didn't quite know what to make of him in the West, but he really became a hero in the East precisely because he vindicated people who had given their life over to prayer, that they weren't wasting their time, like that this actually brings about very real effects, devotion to prayer and that concentrated prayer.
Thank you very much for explaining.
Yeah,
all
great.
right. Thanks. You're gonna go for a run?
Yeah, actually today's tape for bike ride. Yesterday I did, I alternate biking. So
yeah, and I was just about to write you a note. I really wanted to thank you for listening to me and to actually profoundly replying to my question at the beginning of the class. I wanted to thank you because you were talking about John Paul II and healing of memories involves forgetting, and I felt it viscerally. So I just thank you.
Pleasure, Juliana. It's a joy to have you. And
Thank you.
Any student who for whom these things really cut to the heart, I mean, that's what will make you a good theologian, is that you are always learning both with your head and appropriating with your heart and trying to integrate the two. And it's a lifetime's work, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Okay. Take care. Bye.
Bye.